Yeah, he called me right after your after I sent the email out to the class. So, hello everyone hopping on the live stream. All right, I'm going to make sure it's all working. Go to profile, make sure it's streaming everywhere. This is Tom Oord. He's the other person you're seeing right now.
Hey, hello everybody.
So everybody that's hopping in, feel free to let us know in the chat where you're coming from. And also, look, Tom Oord's here. He is a philosophical theologian, like the one that coined and collected together a whole host of scholars across traditions for open and relational theology, which Brian gives multiple shout outs in the book too. So if there are questions specifically about that, we feel free to send them, and we'll definitely get to them. We got
last week, Brian joined my doctoral students in a Q&A, about 20 doctoral students with Brian. He was fantastic, kind of exploring various dimensions of his book, but also as they relate to open and relational thinking.
Nice. Yeah, one, you have cool students, and there's hardly anyone as I know is gifted at handling Q&A from no context of who you are to like super established, like guru status scholar in specific areas. Like Brian has done it all.
Yeah, that's true. He is good on his feet. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you that are hopping, we're going to start in just a second. Brian got internet like an hour ago or so and said, "Oh, I can't believe you got Tom coming. Well, I want to hop on so I can talk with Tom too. If my internet's going to go." He has shown up on our sidebar twice and disappeared. So this is my heads up statement that I'm sure people in a book group for Brian McLaren's own book are not going to be disappointed if the internet actually cooperates for him showing back up. But I don't know. We're going to see. One time I could hear him but couldn't see him. Then it was wiggly. So who knows? Who knows how what Ian is permitting? But hello everyone. All right, Tom. I'm gonna hit record, and then I'm very LA today. I have my Dodger hat because we just set the record for the most wins
in the National
Dodger
League
history.
Oh yeah, I was going to say
110. We're at 110.
The overall best win season was my Seattle Mariners. They didn't make it to the World Series a year. They broke the record, but
no, I've thought about this. That's part of my worry.
Yeah.
And I got the World Championship.
The Lakers.
It's just one of these insulated cups. You can put cold water in it, and it actually is cold 2 hours later without having a lid, because I don't like drinking with lids. I'm prejudiced against lids, but we'll see. Anyway, I'm feeling very, very soaked. And since you were here, I wore my new shirt, which there was no name on the person that sent this. They might be in the group. If you are a nerd and know who Alfred North Whitehead is in the book Process and Reality, the shirt says, "Have you heard the good news in Process and Reality, the corrected edition?" by Alfred North Whitehead. And this color is the color of the book. Tom's dissertation advisor was the one that.
That's right. It was one of the editors that corrected him. Yeah, there was actually several versions of Whitehead's book that they then tried to make decisions on what to put in the corrected edition.
I'm glad Peter agrees with me about lids. All right, so I'm going to hit record. The next things that happen, unless you say something really filthy, Tom, will be on the internet past just the live stream. All right. Alfred North Whitehead is why we are here. Come on, Deb. You got to add a question. By the end, feel free to ask any Whitehead question. We'll answer it last, not to deter anyone. But I'm all down for it. Look, this is the kind of affirmations I like to hear, Tom.
Definitely.
All right, here we go. Ooh, that air horn says it is time. It is time. Uh-oh. Look at this. Look at this. I can see him right here. Look at that.
Oh, good timing.
Whoa. Whoa. Oh, that was the wrong. Where's the clapping? There we go. Clapping. It's, yeah. Ian can't hold you back, Brian.
Oh man. Listen, Ian couldn't hold me back, but it just was a question of whether I had electricity or not, and an internet connection. So we just got that late yesterday, and great to be with you guys. Unexpectedly, I was thinking I was going to have to miss.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'd already emailed everyone. I was so pumped that Tom agreed to show up because not only does Tom get the shout out in the list of theologians that are doing constructive things on the faith, responding to what you're doing. And
Thank you, Brian.
I've told Brian, I said that you two are the competitors for nicest humans I know. Like if on my list, it gets very small. And I was like, how's this going to work? I was like, Tom Oord and Brian McLaren, two of the nicest humans in the world. It might be that you're nice to me, or it could be that I don't know anyone that says mean things about you except that you're heretics. But here's the crazy thing. True story. I've heard a number of people say, oh, you spend a lot of time with Brian McLaren. You're friends with Tom Oord, aren't you? Insert critical comments about things they've said, followed by, but you got to admit, they really are one of the nicest people, right? And I just feel like I pass every time someone says that from quoting the scripture about judging by fruits. So just want you to know the nicest heretics I know are here tonight. We're going to have some fun. And for everyone that's in the Do I Stay Christian book group, no, all my planning was based on Tom being here, not Brian. So Brian and I are going to schedule a second, fourth Q&A because I have a bunch of questions organized that I didn't put in thematic order and prioritize most popular ones. So if you've sent questions, they aren't disappeared. They just aren't the focus because really I want to talk about things I can watch Tom and Brian talk about. So this is going to be fun. All right. So I have an opening question that I want to get Tom to tell his story and then Brian to tell which parts of it he resonates with. Now, both of you grew up in much more conservative, white evangelical context of the church and have had your wrestling with the authority structures. You've had your deep intellectual questings, and you've also done something that not everyone that is doing that personal faith processing does, which is while you're working out your own salvation with fear and trembling, you continue to engage in a broader and bigger tent of the church and outside of it. And those conversations, knowing both of you, have deeply shaped you. And so what I thought would be a great place to start for those that don't know Tom, I'm sure plenty of the homebrewed people know Tom because we hang out on the internet a lot. But I'd love for you, Tom, to kind of give us your own struggle as like the faith you were given when you wrestled with no and those kind of things and the different avenues of coming back to yes and how. Give us your own narrative. And then after that, I would love to hear which parts of it Brian resonates with and any follow-ups that he has given the kind of similar tenor of y'all's journeys.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. And it's good to see you both. I grew up in a really small farming community. My parents were Christians. We went to church often. My parents were on the church board for probably 40 or 50 years, sort of the mainstays of the congregation. I had a fairly positive experience with Christianity growing up. There were some bad things, but overall pretty positive. I became a person who thought that the ultimate goal for humans was to be in heaven and not in hell. And that meant I ought to be an evangelist. So I was the kind of person who annoyed people on airplanes or on beaches, or on city streets, walking up with little track and said, "Hi, my name's Tom. I'd like to introduce you to Jesus Christ." I was one of those kind of evangelists who was a part of Campus Crusade for Christ. And then my senior year of college, I took a course in philosophy of religion and started reading some really smart people who didn't believe in God, who were from other faith traditions. And I realized the reasons I had to believe there was a God at all didn't make a lot of sense. And so I was an atheist for a while. I was engaged to my now wife at the time, and I remember coming to pick her up to go to get some dinner one evening and announcing to her, "I just can't believe in God anymore." Now, for me, this was not, you know, this was not me being upset with hypocritical leaders in the church, which I definitely was upset with those, but that wasn't the main reason. It wasn't because I was 20 something and wanted to sow my wild oats and, thought that Christianity was holding me back morally or something like that. For me, it was really the intellectual questions that led me away from belief in God and away from Christianity for a time. I returned to believing in God based on a search for meaning and an attempt to try to make sense of these deep intuitions that I ought to be a loving person, that somehow love was the answer. I think Brian talks about this in various books he's written, but especially in Do I Stay Christian, when he gets to some of the final chapters. But it was love that was at the center. Um, and strangely enough, my being an atheist for a while and then having to kind of reconstruct what I thought God was like, and Jesus and the church and other religions and science, strangely enough, that's given me a kind of, oh, what's the right word? It's given me courage to be different, to question tradition, to question authorities in the Christian tradition, to put my career and livelihood on the line sometimes because of my beliefs. I'm not saying that is easy because that sucks. I've got lots of scars from that and trauma that I still deal with. And I continue to butt heads with leaders in the tradition that I'm a part of, which is the Church of the Nazarene. I'm an ordained elder still in that tradition. Um, so when I read Do I Stay Christian and actually preached a 6-week series at my local church, I'm an unpaid associate at a local church here, a Church of the Nazarene. Um, I could I could identify with the 10 reasons why people would walk away from Christianity. I could identify with the 10 reasons why people might stay. I'm choosing to stay for various reasons. Um, and I think I share with Brian some similar history with structures and authorities in Christianity that have sometimes been very good to me and other times been very harmful. So I don't know. How does that strike
Mhm.
you, Brian?
Yeah, well, gosh, thanks for sharing that, Tom. I like you. I actually, a lot of people don't know this. I grew up in a tiny little country town in upstate New York, uh, called Olean, New York. And that probably a big difference for me is that our family then made a series of moves and then moved to the Washington D.C. Not sure where that fit in, but anyway, uh, moved to the Washington D.C. area. Da, 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 ding. And so I kind of grew up in a very urban, sort of cosmopolitan area from the middle of elementary school up. So that was one difference. But our religious settings were very similar. Church of the Nazarene. I grew up Plymouth Brethren or Christian Brethren, which in many
Okay.
ways they're sort of restorationist churches that
Mm.
and in some ways this is not super charitable, but I often call it Church of the Last Detail. Other people thought they were biblical, but we got one detail beyond them. We're
Yes.
even more biblical. And I do think Church of the Nazarene has a way cooler name than Brethren. So at least it's not a name based on patriarchy. And like you, I didn't have, well, I was pretty sure as even a young teenager that I was not going to stay Christian. The question of whether I believed in God, I just remember it being more of an intellectual question, and the jury was out for me.
Mm.
Then I ended up having a very deep kind of spiritual experience. Our charismatic and Pentecostal friends would call it a charismatic or Pentecostal experience. My mystical friends would call it a mystical experience. But the primary thing about this experience at about age 15 was that whatever God was, whatever I experienced, it was uncontainable love. And so that sort of put me on this path for my teenage years that I thought, this thing was ultimately about love. So that's something you and I have resonated with,
Yeah.
from different paths. But interestingly, like you, I had a number of periods, not just one, but a number of periods where the word God and the conventional notion of God felt that I could less and less honestly defend it. Yet it was hard to break away from this sense that there's this ultimate reality of love in some way. And so what that in a way put me in the situation very similar to yours is that I had to decide if I would give myself permission to think of God in ways different from the gatekeepers or the authority figures. And somehow I felt that freedom. Usually I would at least find a couple of other friends who were stepping out of some of those boundaries. And I have a feeling that's probably why an awful lot of people tune into Homebrewed and would be part of a conversation like this, because they're aware that they're having to step outside the kind of accepted circle of certain notions, and they wonder if there's anybody else that not even who thinks exactly the way they do, but who at least has a bigger circle. Yeah.
Both of you there kind of touched on one, the intimate connection that you both have for whatever gets itself done when we use the symbol God, and the way love seizes you. And that also is a contested word. But one of the things I think that runs through both of your works is a deep commitment that wherever the word love and God don't cross in the Venn diagram, then those are really bad descriptions of love. Like love that's not big enough for all of creation is subpar love. It could be tribal, right? It could be ordered wrong. If we want to give a shout out to one of the moments Augustine was on point. And so there are all these ways that whenever we use the word love, it needs to be nested in something big enough to contain all creation in its diversity and multiplicity. And whenever we use the word God, if it's not also where it's not also overlapping with this deep reservoir of infinite love, then those concepts of God are things to be set aside.
Wow.
And so I know maybe the way to set up to hear you two reflect on it. Tom wrote, how many books on love? 5 I can think of. And because you're the other side of this camera is my the O section in my library. But Tom wrote books on love across religious traditions, love on engaging the different psychological sciences, evolutionary science, biological science. He wrote books on love in the Christian tradition and biblical. So when you think of that word, like who's against love, Tom? But when you take that Venn diagram of love and God seriously and have done the kind of rigorous interdisciplinary work, are there particular ideas of God that we have to set aside? Because I'd love to hear, and you don't have to speak for everyone, just for you, but I'd love to hear how those resonate with Brian's, because so many of the questions that we haven't got to were questions around how we even use the word God, and do we need to use that word? And I think that y'all share that grounding in love. So kind of share a bit about what you've learned and all that in your kind of intellectual quest.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I was thinking as I was reading Brian's book and preaching it to the congregation that I'm a part of the last couple of months, that I can clearly see a shift in my life from when I was a young person who was committed to Christianity, and I'm still a Christian, but who thought that I was a Christian first and foremost, and then I was trying to figure out what it meant to live a life of love. Today, I want to live a life of love first and foremost. And I'm still attracted to this Jesus guy and the Christian tradition because of my first commitment to love. But as you rightly said, that word love has got so many different understandings, not only between religious traditions, but especially within the Christian tradition. And so, from my way of thinking, I think of love as primarily aiming to toward well-being or flourishing, or what Jesus would call abundant life, or what Hebrew scriptures call the shalom. Um, it's something about thriving in the world, not just amongst humans, but for all creation. And I think even God has a sense of flourishing or well being. And that when we love, when we follow the first commands to love God and love neighbors ourselves, we're actually helping our neighbors and helping God. We're improving God's sense of well being. So, those are kind of fundamental to me as I think about what I want to be and how I want to act and try to have some kind of identity. I want to first of all be a lover and then pursue the questions I have about science, about psychology, or I mean, about the arts, about religions, whatever. Brian, how does that strike you?
Yeah, I love everything you said, and I really liked the way Trip you said that about that Venn diagram, because I can imagine. I don't think I've ever heard you say that, or I've ever heard anybody say that clearly. Part of it is, if our idea of God doesn't intersect with love, we've got a problem. But also the sense that if the love that we believe in, it well, try this on, that maybe when we talk about faith, we talk about taking a risk on the taking a risk on the possibility that love is as big as that circle of God, that
Mm.
love is the ultimate reality. That and suddenly faith, hope, and love seem to me to just sort of go into a chemical reaction when you say that. So I love that. Um, uh, yeah, Tom, really, one of the things I love about your work it is this primacy of love, and also this sense that it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about theology without talking about ethics. Uh,
Mm.
Without talking about it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about, as Jesus said, loving God, unless we also talk about loving people, loving ourselves appropriately, and I think we'd all add loving the earth. So, yeah, that it, some
I think,
it's just ironic that this is considered as something unusual to put
yeah.
love in this position when you have chapters like 1 Corinthians 13 or the Great Commandment in your primary text.
Well, I think it's unusual in part because some of the most important thinkers in the Christian tradition, perhaps other traditions as well, but since I'm most familiar with Christianity, some of the major thinkers understand divine love in completely different ways that they
Yes.
understand human love or creaturely
Yes.
love. And by the time they end up portraying this God of supposed love, he sounds like a jerk.
Yeah.
He sends people to hell for eternity. He only likes some people, the elect, but not others. He thinks people ought to be, straight and can't be non-binary. This God is the kind of God who sends hurricanes, pandemics to punish people. And that's supposed to be love from that perspective. And so when you've got this radical disconnect between our deep intuitions about what love is in our lives and the
Mm.
way this God who is supposedly is love, and how they're two radically different things, it's no wonder people are confused, and no wonder that love starts to fade in importance in systematic theology or Christian theologies, or even just in your local, church or synagogue when you want to talk
Mm.
about God.
Hmm. Both of you, uh, in your responses, it made me think of, uh, one of those moments where you have an idea that you would have, like, if someone had asked you think this, you would have always said yes, but you didn't know what saying yes meant.
Mhm.
I think that I was reading Eberhard Jungel, who's a German theologian, uh, a brilliant guy. I have a love-hate relationship with him. So this isn't like an endorsement of everything he said. But in my favorite book of his, God, the Mystery of the World, he gets in this long conversation, kind of engaging the Johannine affirmation that God is love. And in it, he has this line where he says that that statement, God is love, is the crescendo of the New Testament
Huh.
and the most true statement one can speak about the ultimate.
Mm.
And that is the wager of faith for the Christian.
Wow.
And I just, like, I remember I would have always, if you were like, now, Trip, do you think God's love? I'd have been like, yeah. Like, and I would have probably, because I love demonstrating how much I knew the Bible more than people. I'm like, look, there's only 3 direct statements about the reality of God in the Bible. God is love, God is spirit, God is truth. Everything else, metaphors, symbols, and allegory. Oh, there's all sorts of ways, but you don't get many direct statements. This is ultimate reality, after all. And I remember wrestling with that, that text in response to this sheer disdain I had for American Christianity post 9/11,
Mm.
Yeah.
and thinking that that's the crescendo. So, like, if you take serious,
Mhm.
like, if Christians, what does it mean to be Christian? What does it mean to stay Christian? Part of it is to say something like, when the Venn diagram of love and God overlap, then you get this crescendo of God's self-testimony in the history of Israel in the person of Jesus that God is love. And anything less than that is,
Yeah.
we could call it heresy, but given that I'm talking to 2 heretics, I don't want to trigger you. But I think the recognition that the emphasis on love for people wanting to stay Christian, recognizing the ugliness we have to set aside, we're not planting a flagpole on the liberal agenda. We're actually saying that God's at least as nice and loving and beautiful as Jesus was.
Yeah.
Anything less than that, sub-Christian. So it's like you're going, I'm just taking God's word for it in the incarnation. Are you okay with that? And I think it's okay for us to celebrate that.
Yeah.
I know so many people who want to agree with, like, or are moved by or resonate with this picture, but then that planting the flag that this is like a beautifully deep and faithful Christian response, there's always hesitation. But I think that that perspective of going, God's self-testimony in the history of Israel, in the person of Jesus, in the kingdom message proclaimed and resurrected, that is where you get to say love and God at the same time. And I give myself to it.
Mm, 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 mm.
And from there, you can work out stuff. And that's such a different starting point. But it's hard to be like, that's not biblical. Or it's hard to go, that's not really Christian. Because you're trusting that the word of God incarnate is a faithful place to untangle the big mystery of existence that calls us and made us and lures us and moves us and animates us. Anyway, sorry, it's a Sunday and I haven't preached in a month. So if you too would like to take a Sunday off and you still do digital services, email Trip at Homebrewed Christianity. So anyway,
Hey,
but
Trip,
yeah.
Can I pick up on something
Yeah.
you said there? So it's that you use that word biblical, and how that word biblical in a lot of our backgrounds got thrown around as the standard. I have. I know you said that Tom and I are nice people. What I'm about to say is a little bit snarky, but I wish I had the chutzpah that whenever somebody says biblical, I would say, hold it. Do you mean biblical or do you mean fundamentalist? Because what I think the word actually means for a lot of people is according to fundamentalist orthodoxy. Because the fact is, an intelligent, honest reader of the Bible would say that how did he say it? That guy you quoted, a crescendo toward
Yeah.
love. I mean, if you think about the story of the Bible, you have sort of this primal condition, and then you have the patriarchs who lead to the law, and then the law leads to the prophets, and the prophets point toward justice, compassion, and humility. And then Jesus comes along embodying justice, compassion, humility, says the greatest commandment is love. And then Paul just pushes that to the limit to make a statement like, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any meaning at all. Talk about a slap to the law. But the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself in love. The problem isn't the Bible. The problem is fundamentalist readings of the Bible that put every verse at the same level rather than seeing that crescendo, right? So, yeah, I'm glad you want to reclaim the Bible in that. And I just think that it's so sad, it's so sad the dirty work that term biblical is employed to do by a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay. Here's something that I learned from Tom. I don't think I've told him that I think connects to this moment. So this is, occasionally I give him nice shout outs. But when I was an undergrad because that's what we met my sophomore year of undergrad, because I won the Society of Biblical Literature competition for my historical exegesis paper. And then you were like, do you want to meet John Cobb at the American Academy of Religion? I'm like, do I? I was like, he's my second favorite JC. And you sent me your new book, or one of your new books, and you started sending me your books. And one of them was like looking at love across religious traditions. And at this time, I just discovered process thought, because I was like philosophical deconstructionalist. Like I had annotated my Caputo and Derrida and Deleuze text, and I thought Nietzsche was I'm like, why do people not understand? Anyway, so I was like at this place where I was more attracted to the narratives of the Gospels and the character of Jesus than ever some metaphysical statement about God. And then I learned about process thought, and that kind of led to me thinking, oh, you mean there might be a metaphysical picture about God, that a philosophical account of God that is similar and more deeply nested in the life and ministry of Jesus. So we start talking. You send me your love book, and you have a couple bits in it where you mention one of the unique things Christianity contributes across the religious traditions when it goes to the nature of love is that the love of enemy is not debatable. And you don't have an option not to, basically. And there in the text, you talk about other unique things of other religious traditions. But I remember this moment in undergrad where I was fasting, and then I decided to drink, which I don't want to advise this person. Look, I was 21. Okay. So I'd been fasting. It's during Lent, and one very large, Alicia would say, Trip, that's 3 shots. It's not one. Bourbon while doing your Bible study late at night. And I had been thinking about that, and I'm reading the Gospels, and it gets to that command. And I have this nerdy moment where I go, and I say this because if you think through part 3 of Brian's book, where he goes, we got to think about stages of development. And how one moves personally through stages of development. We have to think about how religions and culture, if we don't nestle them in a wisdom tradition, cultivate desires known and unknown. We have to think about how we give ourselves and find ourselves in the flow of history and the big movements, right? Like, how do we come to consecrate again the world? All these kinds of things are sitting there. And I say to myself, in the world, totally left so much of the institutional commitment behind because of the church's response to 9/11. And yet, where's the one place that confesses love for enemy is non-negotiable? I had this like deep spiritual experience where I go, now I don't know if there's a real God, but I have a lot of footnotes that one's well-being is significantly better if you participate in a religious community. And so I'm choosing to engage in the mythopoetic structure of enemy love as ultimate reality, whether it exists or not, truest testimony. And I would say, if you asked me after that experience, do I stay Christian? I've always heard that question to go, is the world better off if the people that inherit the story of Jesus are deeply committed to communities that attempt to help us develop in our stages to love our enemy? And I wanted to be one of those as a minister and as a theologian that's committed to it, as someone that has a podcast and does book groups, but also just as a parent and as someone engaged in the local congregations, whether I've worked at them or not. Like, we need communities. If you think of all the big issues that Brian and I've talked about, the tribal issue, the political issues, the economic system that grabs our desires and moves us to manipulate each other and pillage the planet, the way our desires are harnessed by algorithms towards tribal. Anyway, all these kind of things. I remember the moment of going, oh, junk. See, I just self-edited, Tom, because you're in the holiness tradition. I don't know if I can muster God, but I can muster giving yourself to enemy love as what's necessary for us to get through the great filter as a species. Mm-hmm. And I remember wrestling with it. And Terry Michael Newell, who's my campus minister, I mentioned this to him, and he goes, yeah, Trip, but the brilliant thing about Jesus is that's a transferable wisdom for those that have ears to hear. Nice. After all, Gandhi had to teach it to King.
Yeah.
And I just was like, oh, junk. Anyway, so one of the reasons I stayed Christian was that insight. So when you think, and I know Brian talks about this in the book, when we use the word love as Christian, how is that difficult? And what is the demand being made past the kind of cultural notion of love when it's easy, love those that are like you?
Yeah. I like to use that phrase overall well-being when I think about love's aim. And I like that phrase because it means it's not only love for neighbor, not only love for stranger, but also love for enemy, love for other creatures, love for myself, love for God, trying to promote the well-being of all that exists. And that's a huge, grand vision. Christians aren't the only ones who care about overall well-being. And I think that's one of the strengths of Brian's book is his recognition that Christians aren't the only ones who care about love. However, I do think there are some practices in some Christian traditions. There are some ways of thinking about God in some theologies that can actually inspire and motivate us to love in that kind of way. When I got done preaching Brian's book, got to the last chapter and kind of did a summary for the congregation, I said, I'm planning to stay Christian. Everyone was shocked, but I said, I think there are certain ways of thinking about being a Christian, certain ways of thinking about God that are helpful, and others just plain suck. And there's no good reason to stay Christian if you're going to continue to affirm some of these bad views of God and bad ways of living Christianly that Brian suggested. So I guess maybe to respond to your question, Trip, I think love is central to good versions of Christianity, to helpful visions of God. And I want to see what it looks like to pursue those and develop them socially, intellectually, ecclesially, and all the kinds of dimensions of life in which we're a part. How does that strike you, Brian?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's it. And this is where and this in many ways is what I tried to do in that third part of the book. Because if we get too hung up on the word Christian, do I stay Christian? It can distract us from the deeper question is deeper questions such as how dedicated am I to becoming the most loving version of myself that I can be?
Yeah.
How dedicated am I to promoting love wherever I see it? As I don't know if you mentioned this before I was able to get on trip, but obviously I live in Southwest Florida, so I've been in the presence of Ian this week, the hurricane, and one of the things that happens in a tragedy like this is you just see people stepping outside themselves for each other, and so you have this feeling like today I or in these last few days, I have felt this stirring of solidarity with people who live in this part of the world
Mm.
that I haven't deeper than I think I've felt it in the 13 or however many years I've lived here. Um, and I got a note from a couple of friends, one a rabbi and one Sikh activist and author, Sikh activist and author, who remembered visiting me down here and me talking about how much I loved the the natural environment here and how sad I was that probably in my lifetime it will be destroyed exactly by the kind of thing that just happened with this super intense hurricane. And uh and I especially feel that today because it's in a lot of churches today is celebrated as the feast of Saint Francis. And something that you feel just about everybody knows Saint Francis Canticle to the Sun or Canticle to Creation. And what Saint Francis refers to as brother and sister isn't just the wolf or the sparrow or the manatee or whatever. Fire is a brother or sister. The
Mm.
moon is a brother or sister. Water is a brother or sister. The reality of death is a brother or sister. And it's so this is an affinity, not just with other living creatures, but with the very elements of nature themselves. And to have this sense that all of creation is in some way being invited into the participation in love. I mean, some people might think that's just ridiculous, but there is a way that you see the world sometimes and you just say, no, I actually think that's what's happening here. I actually think that's
Mhm.
what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in there real quick, Trip?
Yeah, yeah.
That chapter Brian wrote on rewilding, oh, that was like near and dear to my heart. Brian and I share a deep love for the outdoors and spend time with nature in various ways. When I
Which
preached the
Tom won't plug, but you should all. I linked in the email for today his website. If you go on top of following Tom's academic work, if you join his email list, he sends out what's it like quarterly photo diaries. Tom's a wonderful photographer
Yeah.
and is an avid hiker in beautiful wild places.
Mm.
And if you're lucky, at some point you'll hear him give a talk explaining his spirituality with his nature photography. Anyway, Tom, go ahead and say
Thanks
what you
for
want, but every time you send them, I'm like, oh, and I always think I don't want to run into something where I'm in their food chain. And I'm glad you took the picture.
Thanks for those kind words, Trip. But when I was reading that chapter, Brian, I was my mind went to a philosophical notion that I'd love to throw out real quick. And this philosophical notion is that we have a pre-linguistic apprehension of reality. Um, that is, words are powerful, language is powerful, spoken, written, whatever. Uh, but we sometimes get fooled, as you say in that chapter, into thinking that's the whole of things. But experiences in nature, whether you're out in the wilderness like I like to do, or just gardening in your backyard, or hanging out with your dog, those, I think, remind us there's something even more fundamental than language. And if God is at that realm as well, then it's no wonder our language can't capture everything we might want
Yeah.
to say about God.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. So let me first say, echo Tripp and saying I follow you, Tom, on Instagram, so I get to see a lot of your photography. You know, it's one of my favorite things on Instagram. Um,
Thanks.
and one of the things that's so wonderful, this is a tangent, but to think of you as a theologian deeply interested in process, and yet your art form is the snapshot. But that's part of the meaning of a snapshot, is that when you have that,
Yes.
you have that image right at sunset, and you know that it will soon be dark.
Mhm.
And in some ways, that's the preciousness of the snapshot, because every instant that's captured is an instant that's unrepeatable, and that's why it's worth capturing and valuing, you know. Um,
Yes, yes.
um, but this, I think Tripp and I maybe talked about this before, but
Oh.
one of my fears is that the deepest pre-linguistic reality that shapes our thought is economics. In other words, I think because of our security needs, according to Maslow, um, I think we are so geared toward economic security that one of the pre-linguistic things that forms us is everything that has to do with how our moms and dads made a living and gave us a feeling of security, you know. And then we
Mhm.
start to pick up the global economy, and what the way I feel, this is sort of a simple way to say it, is that we're either going to be formed by economy or ecology. And the
Oh.
wisdom of the shape of things in the earth, uh, it's just it forms us. We later can talk about it and put words to it. But I think for those of us who have this wonderful gift of being able to face creation and feel deeply for how storms form and shape and spread, and how coastlines evolve, and all of these things that are part of this amazing ecological system here on this planet. I mean, we start to feel that when we hear the word wisdom, wisdom is pointing to that set of patterns. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks, Brian.
Oh wow. Um, one of the challenges I think of rewilding that comes across in that chapter, and there are a couple of questions about it. That don't worry if you send it in, the specific ones we can do that next time. But when I read that chapter, and there were a number of questions around this that thought, what do you do when your articulation of God, the linguistic structure you used, was the means to the encounter? And I think a lot of people shaped by Enlightenment understandings of knowledge, of epistemology, of certainty, and such, saw uh, the ideas you have about God, the language and things, as the
Yeah.
means by which you encounter ultimate
Yeah.
reality. And part of the challenge of that rewilding chapter is to recognize that our language was something that we developed. I mean, it was an evolutionary breakthrough for a biological species. It emerges and emerges first in communitarian art. I mean, like I said, that's the current, be it drumming, dancing, these kinds of things. The ability to tell stories so you cooperate for the well-being of the community. I mean, this is kind of how it emerges, and then religion emerges out of that. If you tell the big story. Now, if you take the, I don't know, evolutionary, panentheistic, evolving concept of God that runs through the book that Tom and I have a deep resonance with, then in some sense, right, the emergence of religion is the emergence of a response network conscious response network, because God's always been invested in every moment with every creature in any way, but a conscious response network for communities to respond to the giver of meaning, beauty, love, goodness, justice, the one that calls every moment, right? And so in some sense, the generation of religion, the generation of a symbolic species that can cooperate and thrive across difference in numbers, is a gift of the divine. It's a gift of a kind of knowledge, and we don't have to do an exegesis of Genesis to go, this is exactly what was being testified to in that text. But when we get into the enlightenment space, and the technology of religion has been reduced this and flattened the same way the Enlightenment reduced and flattened creation to efficient causation, matter in motion, so that what did we do? The scientific power, which, look, everyone here loves science. I mean, that was literally what I was teaching last 3 years. So this isn't a negation of science. It's a tool for a particular part of the world, but not the whole thing.
Yes.
And so that I feel like when we recognize that so much of our inherited religion was lusting after the power of science, that the economy is controlled, then in some sense, recognizing that religious technology, the symbolic ritual constructions, the mythopoetic nature of religion, is a means by which we cooperate to engage the ultimate that knows us, loves us, beckons us, calls us each moment, that reframes what the language is doing, right? Yeah. It is now something that comes from the impulse of wilding, as opposed to something that goes to the wild to control it. And it's a switching of the power move. And we aren't going to survive as a people if we can't, if we continue to articulate a world, where we aren't a part of nature and nature's something to be made a means to our own end. So, sorry, Brian, I know you wanted to say something, and then.
Well, no. All I was going to say is, any of you who've read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, get a feel for someone who is a scientist, but a non-reductive scientist, someone whose approach to science doesn't exclude things like awe and wonder and mystery and respect and affection and love and solidarity and all the rest. In other words, there's a kind of Enlightenment science that was like Enlightenment philosophy that said, when we're doing science, we are no longer human beings with bodies and feelings and emotions who know we're going to die. We turn into something else. And when we do philosophy, we're just abstract, rational beings. We aren't people with vested economic and political interests and career needs and all the rest. And I think in some ways, that oft battered but still standing word postmodern, part of what the postmodern moment is, as Jack Caputo said, becoming enlightened about the Enlightenment and realizing that in the Enlightenment, we were still human beings with vested interests, so that the great Enlightenment philosophers might not have known it consciously, but they were probably being influenced to develop philosophies that would help white Europeans control the world. And as were religious leaders and so on. So here we are at this moment, and there's this strangeness. Tripp, you really referred to this after 9/11, when you watched how Christians responded to 9/11, and others probably had their awakening after George Floyd's murder or after Donald Trump's election, or there was some moment where they just said, what has this religion become? Has it always been this, or is it getting worse, or is it both? And yeah, so at those moments, we have this sort of, things begin to fall apart. We begin to deconstruct. And then now we're on this journey to see, can anything be put back together? Or maybe not even can anything be put back together, but what is putting us back together? And yeah.
Oh, that's good. One of the themes that's come up in the chat, and there are a number of questions about, was like how you explored the cult of innocence and in the text. Now, but Tom mentioned earlier, like having been similarly harmed and sought out. Like, I mean, both of you have in many ways from the communities of faith that gave you an encounter with the divine mediated by Jesus. And then we're like, whoa, don't be faithful in that way. Brian, Tom, come back over here. I'd love for you, Brian, to kind of unpack that like how you came to see innocence in the way it's generated differently. And then let Tom kind of know he's been preaching about it at his church in such respond. And then I'll see while you're doing that, I'll pull up the questions related to this section and see which ones make sense for a conversation, because Tom won't be here next time. And this was definitely one of the parts of the book I wanted to hear about. So this is Tripp selfishly reorganizing our conversation.
So maybe I can say two things. First, where I got, started thinking about innocence, started really with Rene Girard, who, and we won't try to do a summary of his theory. I've done short summaries of his many brilliant ideas in a number of places. But one of the things that Rene Girard becomes interested in is how we take a victim and we use victims. And the use of victims is critical. One of the ways we use victims, for example, is we hold up someone who was hurt or killed by some other group, and we say, let's unite to avenge the death of this person. A victim can become a super unifying element for any political party or nation that then wants to go and make more victims. The irony is striking. And in that way, in the Gospels, when the risen Christ appears to the disciples, he doesn't show them his hands and his feet and say, you are my witnesses. Now go into all the world and kill those bastards who did this to me. Wreak revenge on them because I'm the Son of God and they killed me. And now it's your duty to avenge God by killing all those people. But he says, go and preach a gospel of forgiveness to all the world. I mean, it's just stunning, right? He doesn't play the victim card, even though he's the victim. Well, once you know that, then you also, if you grow up conservative Christian, Catholic or Protestant, you know that there's this thing called penal substitutionary atonement theory that's all about using Jesus as a victim. And it reminds me of Dallas Willard, who said, many Christians are vampire Christians who want Jesus for his blood and little else. And it's the sense that they're using the victimhood of Jesus to procure pardon for all of their wrongs. All of those things are sort of floating around in my mind. And then really what congealed it for me was the issue of abortion, because watching how an innocent unborn child is used by people to justify storming the Capitol on January 6th and calling for the hanging of Mike Pence and leading to all other kinds of absolute insanity. Yet you know that most of those people who were storming the Capitol, that was the happiest day of their life. And they never felt more innocent than when they were doing it. So all of this way that innocence becomes abused has been a big fascination of mine. And it came to the fore in this book because when I think, why do I want to leave Christianity at times? It's because I don't want to be associated with these buffoons. I don't want to be associated with these unself-aware bigots. And suddenly I watch myself saying, I want to be innocent because they're guilty. I want to separate myself. We were talking before about loving your enemy or your opponent or the other. And suddenly I realize, in the name of innocence, I'm just trying to break solidarity and connection to all of those people.
Yeah.
That was one of the highlights when I was preaching your book to the church, Brian, was for me looking out at the congregation. And I know a certain number, well, I know most everybody in the congregation, but a certain number of them no longer believe in God, no longer identify as Christian. And then to talk about, going through the first part of your book, the 10 reasons to leave Christianity, it's pretty depressing by the time you get to the end. And there, all those people are going, yeah, exactly. This is why I can't believe in God. I'm not even sure
Well,
why
look,
I'm
you
here
got
this
them to
morning.
yell amen at church. They haven't done it in years.
Yes. But then to say, yes, Christians have done horrid things. There's certain versions of Christianity that repulse. But you all, me, none of us is totally innocent here. None of us
Yeah.
have done it right and perfect. That's a powerful move in the book. It really hit me, and I think it hit the people in the church when I was talking about that. But then when I got to the end of this series, Brian, I was kind of summing up, and I was saying, look, some versions of Christianity suck, some churches suck, but you can't live on your own very well either. Don't try to be the individual who just lets American culture just kind of waft you along, and you're just going to buy into whatever the ideas are that are popular at the time. You got to be a part of a community that's trying to make the world a better place. Um, and so then, of course, I wanted to say, and our community is that community. Because, we do want to love, but I look at our community and see all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I guess my question for you, Brian, is the reality that none of us are innocent,
Yeah.
the reality that some groups I think are really better than others. I don't want to say everybody sucks equally.
Yes. Yes.
Then how do you offer something to the person who's trying to decide whether they want to be in or out, given those realities?
Yes. I think I'm glad you're bringing this up, because something I didn't want to do in the book was to give those 10 reasons why a person might not want to stay Christian, and then come to this thing about innocence and say, you're stuck. You're a bad person if you leave. If I
Yeah.
could go and add a sentence or two to clarify, I would say, look, there are some people who need to leave the Christian
Yeah.
community because it's doing so much harm to them. But what I'm trying to say in that innocent section is, be aware that in your very act of separating yourself, you can be replicating some of the very things you're trying to escape.
Mm,
And this is where, in some ways, why I became less concerned in the last third of the book about whether a person identifies as a Christian or not. And I'm more, in a sense, making a moral appeal for a different form of life, a different way of life, that's centered on love, that's centered on solidarity rather than exclusion. So what that means in my situation is, um, I'm pretty horrified by what, like where I live in Southwest Florida, a lot of people have American flags, and it's not always true, but very often when they put up that American flag, especially if it's the thin blue line version and all the rest, is a racial message is being sent, a political message is being sent. I should say a racist message is being sent very often. Um, and yet those are my neighbors, and those are beloved people. And I oppose them politically, but at the same time, I have to see them through eyes of love. And at the same time, I have to hope for the redemption. And at the same moment that I'm so angry at their ignorance, I have to, at the same moment, understand that there are reasons why they're ignorant.
yeah.
And
No.
and all of that suddenly becomes the energy of love. And as you said, wanting the, complete, well-rounded well-being and shalom for everyone, ultimately, not just saying some people are irredeemable and disposable.
Yeah. So when I was looking through the questions around this chapter, in the book, Brian, you use the way the right has played out, the question of abortion, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, by not wanting to be a scare quote theologically, or maybe a hell quote, yeah, like a baby killer, right? It ultimately justifies a kind of allegiance to politically engaged power that does all sorts of things that may be against your values if you were to deeply reflect on them, and ultimately justify the kind of engagement in the world where you are less responsive to the needs of your neighbor, human and non, that you're less compassionate to the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, right? Like, and you lay that out. And I know that both of you, because of your shared historic heretical status, have had the ire of Christians turned against you for different issues. And there were a couple of questions that were specific about how you were to deal with different, or how you would reframe it around different issues. And two of them, I know Tom has gotten in a lot of trouble for. So my thought was to, I'll throw one out, let y'all discuss it, and then throw the other out. And that way, Tom can decide, given this is live streaming on the internet, how much he wants to say or not say, because I didn't tell him I was going to suggest this. But the first one I think is a little safer. But the first one is like fidelity to taking your question seriously when it goes to reading scripture. Specifically, here's one of the questions from Sarah. She said, the cult of innocence so often demands ignorance when reading the Bible. For example, I was told I could no longer teach Sunday school to sixth graders because I didn't believe in a literal atom. Honestly, I don't know what believing in a literal atom or not really means, but they told me they don't reject science, just that we need a literal atom. Whatever. Anyway, so and that was in a longer story about innocence. Now, Tom, I know you've had encounters in your own tradition around science that are much more public than the second topic. So I'd love to hear y'all frame how that notion of innocence, where you take a privilege of your religious tradition in a sense that justifies anger. Like how do you engage it thoughtfully and generatively when so many of the people you're talking to are animated by unconscious animus of sorts? And before you say this, I just want everyone to know I deeply love both of you and wish I was this kind when people say these things. My email responses, which I set on trigger so I can delete them in the morning sometimes, are, I don't have an answer, you're ignorant. And then I delete it in the morning, but I feel good sending it because I have an auto delay. But anyway, so yeah. Okay, so the first one is that is around scripture, science, Adam, and such.
I'll start and just be brief, Brian, then I'd love to hear your thoughts. One of Brian's ideas in Do I Stay Christian, and it's in various other books, is he likes to talk about movements that come in history that bring about positive change that then become institutionalized for good reason so that they can have staying power. But then when then another wave of ideas comes along, there's this tension between the institution that's trying to preserve something good from the past and the new wine and the old wineskin sort of a thing. And I try to think about the science kinds of questions, the way to understand scripture in light of that. Um, I think I'm a part of a tradition that has a really positive elements in its history that has been institutionalized in a denomination and ways of thinking as trying to hold on to those gains. But then when something new comes around the corner, some new way of thinking about an old question or even a new question, then there's tension there. And it's natural for lots of people to want to defend what's been helpful in the past. And when I suggest something that's different, they often don't take kindly to that. So, in my best mode of interpretation, Trip, I say those people are trying to, they don't want to give up on what they find as positive, And that's the reason why they react so negatively to my alternative views of science or ways of interpreting scripture or that kind of thing.
Mm. I'm about to say the same thing from a different angle. Look, one of the problems we human beings have is how we keep from killing each other, and how we keep from fighting with each other all the time, and how we keep from tearing each other apart, and how we form a group and then we split the group and then we split the splits. And so we have this problem. How do we bring people together? And the way we generally do that is by giving certain people authority, giving certain people leadership permission, and leadership power. I mean, power is such an interesting thing to think about. I mean, in a certain sense, it's power is just an it's like a set of agreements that we enter into, and very often we don't even know where all the fine print that's in the agreement, but there's this unwritten contract of what it means. And so, in the political world, one of the ways that people gain power is that they are given concentrated violence. And if you disagree with them, they have the right to put you in jail or whip you or take your money or kill you or banish you or something. What do you do in religious communities where that kind of power isn't totally appropriate? And so one of the big struggles in religious communities is when they start to have divisions, how does somebody assert their power? And for many of the early centuries of the Christian religion, you asserted your power through apostolic succession. You have to accept what I say because I was ordained by so-and-so, who was ordained by so-and-so, who was ordained by so-and-so. And back there was Peter and was ordained by Jesus. And I've got the line. That's why you have to listen to me. The Protestant Reformation breaks that up. How do people gain power? And they say it's because of the authority of the Bible. But ironically, the Bible never says anything unless anybody reads it and talks about it. And so people read the Bible and talk about it, and the Bible becomes their means of reinforcing their authority. So here's the interesting thing. If authority figures bring groups together based on agreements about how they interpret the Bible, and if you disagree with that, the group will be fragmented. It loses trust in its authority figures. And in the book, those authority figures trust, and they're afraid they're going to lose all those good things you talked about, Tom, like potluck dinners and getting together to sing and having friends of different ages and so on. And so, ironically, every little crossed T and dotted I of biblical interpretation threatens your whole way of life and all the benefits that come to you through community. I mean, that's in one way so obvious, but in another way, maybe it's not that obvious to some people.
And think about the ways that people respond in those situations, Brian. There's certain people in the world who think to themselves, look, a lot of this stuff is trivial. I'm not going to get in an argument over, I don't know, how to interpret this passage or whether or not people ought to be dunked or sprinkled in baptism. Come on, let's not worry about the details. Let's only worry about the essentials. And those people, they make a good point often, but then they sort of kind of move along and they're not really open to any kind of rethinking of ideas because they want to keep the status quo. Let's not have a big fracas here. Let's not get in fights. Let's hug. Let's all come together. And I get that. I get that. And sometimes that's the right mode. Sometimes we do fight over stupid things that we don't need to fight over. But sometimes things go bad. The institution goes sour. There are ideas that undermine the well-being of the whole. There are ideas that ostracize and harm people. And this notion of, well, let's not worry about things that don't really matter, mean that those negative things go unchecked.
Yes.
And that's when people like me who sometimes just think, I don't give a rip, I'm going to say what I think is right, we end up coming into major conflict with leadership. That's been the case in my life.
Mhm.
Yes. Yeah. And ironically, what a way we could say it is the leaders who say that's a debatable issue. It's not an essential. It's not a salvation issue. It's not a
Yep.
biblical, core issue. They're making an interpretive judgment. And
Yes.
and they might and all the congregation accepts their authority, so they accept that judgment. And and when you look back, especially as three white American males, and we think about the white American males who for hundreds of years said women cannot be in leadership, and who said white people have supremacy, all of that kind of stuff was carried on by people who were using the Bible to prove it. And
Yeah.
if anybody disagreed with them, they'd be disturbing the peace. And that's how one of the best ways that religion perpetuates injustice
Yep.
and harm.
Totally
Yeah.
agree.
Mhm. Tom, check your text message. I sent you a text message
Okay.
about what was about to happen. Just want to make sure you look at it before you unless you're going to tell me no. Now, before we get to that part, like I'd love, I would love for you to share, Tom, because there are a couple of questions about the way, especially in the last few years, there's been like a renewed intensity on the right because of trans individuals around LGBTQ stuff.
Mhm.
And now I mentioned at the beginning how both of you have been wonderful, like mentors and inspirations, but the way you handled uh, the kind of inquiries that came towards you around advocating inclusion in your own denomination and thinking about it, like to honor the tradition of the denomination and honest processes, but also to state clearly your convictions and such. I found that to be so beautiful. And one of
Thanks.
the people in the class who we mentioned it briefly in one of our big God question sessions, which if you don't follow Homebrewed, like every couple months, Tom and I get together and I save questions people send in that you would really need to like lose sleep over philosophical questions to want to discuss, and we do them. Which one came out today, so you should go check it out. But the there are a couple of questions around being in denominations that are in process around the sexuality question, the way the kind of cult of innocence is played out. And I found the way you used your privilege and status in a real beautiful way. So I'd love for you to share a bit about wrestling, how you thought through that and did it. And then we'll do the concluding bit. But I I just there are people that have asked questions. What do I do with authority when I have commitments that are deeply connected to how I see Fidelity as a follower of Jesus in communities and institutions that are in flux and wrestling? And
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
what you did
So
was more beautiful than parting the Red Sea. So I just think,
oh, give me a break.
well, no, a miracle is a metaphysical gimmick. Uh, so uh,
Oh, well, let me begin by saying I'm an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene. The Church of the Nazarene's views on LGBTQ issues is more on the conservative side of things, whereas I think the church ought to change and have a fully affirming stance toward LGBTQ people. Um, I've thought this for 20 years and tried to figure out the appropriate way to move the denomination in what little ways I can toward full affirmation. I'm in the minority, but it's a growing minority. And so that gives me hope. Back in November, I was charged by a group of people in my denomination with various things, but the main one was being out of step with the denomination's stance on LGBTQ issues. And so I had to go before a disciplinary or a committee that would decide whether or not I should be disciplined. And then that was reviewed by yet another committee. And I had the chance then to write a long document making my claim for why the Church of the Nazarene ought to be fully inclusive, fully affirming. I had the opportunity. I was given the opportunity. I think some people in hierarchy would have preferred that I just left the denomination, just walked away. And there have been lots of people who have in the Church of the Nazarene, and I don't fault them at all. We're each in different places, but I thought to myself, it kind of makes it easier on the status quo if people who think differently leave without suggesting different ways of thinking about difficult issues. So I decided to stay and defend myself and try to see if what would happen. I did not have to go through a disciplinary uh, um, hearing. The group that heard my case decided that they were not going to discipline me. Now, that could change at any moment. I suspect there are others who will bring up further charges. So I don't want to give any kind of impression that my case is settled shut and, uh, we're all in process, and so is this situation. But I thought, for a number of reasons, I wanted to stay and make a case for why Christians ought to be fully affirming, and that is, as I understand it, the way of love. I recognize people who think differently than me on this issue will appeal to love, but I have a different view of love than I think they do, or I at least see things differently in terms of my experience with LGBTQ people. I think I've got science on my side. I think I've got lots of reasons to be fully affirming. I don't know. Now I'm kind of rambling. Trip, am I getting at what you were asking me?
The one other part was, at least you sent me your whole
Defense. Yeah.
defense, and the beautiful part in it was how you noted how many deep commitments the denomination has now that were minority opinions before.
Yeah.
And so
We were
part
one of
of
the
your
first to have
logic to
women in
stay.
ministry.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
go ahead. I mean, so I was meaning that in the very beginning of the "Do You Stay Christian? Yes" chapters for Brian, where one of the reasons you stay yes, and one of the reasons what you do with your privilege is saying yes loudly. And then in part 3, he says announcing and pronouncing your deep commitments. I found the way you did that both to honor the tradition and the conversation, and to say, I refuse to be anything less than an ally for those that aren't fully affirmed.
Yeah. He also, Brian, talks about staying defiantly. And so that's what I'm doing. But, there are so many factors that come into play here. I don't want to give the impression that people who left are in the wrong. Sometimes people do need to leave groups, and that's important. For me, when I was made aware of these charges that I was going to have to go through a formal process, I told the person who is in the leader of my denomination who told me this, that I wanted to face the charges, except if my wife decided that she didn't want to have to go through another traumatic experience because of her husband's views on things. And fortunately, I have a courageous wife. And not everybody has that kind of support system. So I don't want to give the impression that, I stand alone and I can do it because I'm the beneficiary of so many resources, so much support, including an amazing wife, and other people are in different places. But to your point, one of my arguments was the Church of the Nazarene that I'm a part of. We've ordained women in ministry since the beginning. We've taken countercultural stances in the past, and we've made the claim that to be holy is to live a life of love. So I want to make the argument, if we're really going to live that out, we need to be fully affirming people. Now, whether or not that argument will win the day, who knows?
Yeah. Oh, I just think that's a beautiful example of so much of what Brian was describing. One of the reasons to say yes is because you get to go You get to use your privilege in ways that if you say no, you don't.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So as we wrap up, Tom, you have been preaching through the book, which obviously meant you read it.
And
I
not
would
only read
like
it, I listened to it as well. I got both the reading and the listening.
Ooh, took a double version of it. Now, I'd like to hand the mic to you for the last two questions. If you want to ask the question or to provoke Brian to say whatever you want on behalf of the community you've gone through the book for, or if you want a question around just like Tom Oord happened to say yes to Tripp to talk about this, and then Brian McLaren showed up. So I'm going to not say anything unless provoked. Why you close things out talking to Brian?
Okay, I've got one thing to say, Brian, and it's a theology kind of a question. All right. When I was finished preaching this series, I was thinking, and you probably do this yourself when you read books you really like. I was thinking, could have I written this book? And if I had written something like it, what would have I done differently? So answered that to my own mind by thinking, yeah, I could have written a book in which I laid out 10 reasons why people should leave Christianity, 10 reasons why people should stay, and then something that whether you're staying or going, sort of is at the heart of things. But knowing who I am, Brian, and knowing my love for theology, I would have had a section in which I tried to lay out a beautiful picture of God, a theology that would inspire and motivate, that would make sense of science, the arts, culture, that would align with what I think is the best parts of scripture. I would have had this theological flourish at the end because that's who I am. If you had to add another chapter to the book where you got to do your theological flourish, what might be some of the elements in that theology?
Yeah. So what a great question, and a terrible question to ask at the end of the night. So maybe we should pick up on that. That should be part of our final discussion that Tripp and I have. Maybe Tripp can
Good
bring us
idea.
back to that. But let me just say, the one place in the book where I tried to do that was in the chapter called "To Free God," and
Yes.
I brought up this beautiful quote from Barbara Brown Taylor, who is someone who I think one of the reasons she has been so inspiring to so many people is because that's where her quest has led her, and in her book, The Luminous Web, I just thought she just did such a lovely job of that. But Tom, the other thing that your question gives me a chance to do is to say that's a book that I hope I can someday write, unless you write it first, and I don't need to,
No,
or
you need to write
someone else
it.
does. But here's the honest feeling I have. I have this feeling that I've been peeling an onion, and I'm so glad I didn't try to write a book like that 5 years ago, because in the last 5 years, I've peeled away a few more layers, and then that exposes something else. And so it'll be interesting to see when I feel ready to write about that sort of thing, if I ever do. Um, because part of the struggle that I've been feeling as I wrote this book, and that I feel at this moment, is on the one hand, want to affirm all the metaphors that have been used through the centuries to talk about God, and all of the language and debates and arguments to talk about God, because every one of them was grappling with something of substance. And even if it wasn't, and the fact that it helped people in the 8th century or 12th century or 19th century, that doesn't mean it's going to help people today. And finding the metaphors and language that are as appropriate and relevant to our world today as those arguments were to their context. One of the challenges for me is that I was so deeply embedded in all of that old language.
Yep.
And as were, I think, almost all of us. And and so I feel I'm still trying to strip some of it away. And the other part of it is, if some of this is thought process, which it absolutely is, and if some of this is personal experience, as it absolutely is, and if whatever the word mystical might mean, if some of this is mystical, something about it integrates all of those, and it takes a while to get there. So
Yeah.
I hope that helps. That's an honest response to your question. Probably not a thorough answer, but
It reminds me of this summer I was speaking up in Vancouver, British Columbia at a very progressive church. And it was one of those things where it was an evening, a weekday evening where people came just to hear me. And I gave my presentation, and the conversation afterward really revolved on my use of the word God. Many of the people there had been so hurt by religious contexts in which the word God was used, they no longer wanted to use that word. They had other alternatives: spirit, divine, ultimate reality, ground of being. They had all kinds of things on the table. And my heart went out to them, because I too gave up on the word God for a while because of all the baggage that I've been through. And then I realized that, like, I have come back to embrace that word despite all of its negative implications for some
yes,
people, because, like, I have this different vision of what that is, and I kind of want to make an apology for
yeah,
continuing to use that problematic word, but with a different way of thinking
yes.
about the divine reality.
Yes, 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 yes. Okay, hey, Trip, I know our time's up. Can I tell a super quick story that's just relevant
Can
to this?
Brian McLaren tell a story? All right. Well, since everyone joined to hear you talk about your book, I am going to give you permission, Brian.
Okay,
All right.
real quick, real quick. After September 11th, I was invited to a wonderful gathering at Yale University. Yeah, I guess maybe it was Yale Div School. I'm not sure. Um, it was hosted there. It was called Common Word Between a Common Word document, and it brought Muslim and Christian scholars and leaders together to try to say, what does it mean for Christians and Muslims to love one another? Because we both agree that the command to love one another is the greatest commandment, and or is part of the great commandment. And there were this morning of lectures. A Christian would lecture, a Muslim would lecture, a Christian would lecture, a Muslim would lecture. And then they finally open up for questions. There was a long line of people to go up for questions, and most of them gave speeches and didn't ask a question. As you would predict, a problem Christians and Muslims share. But this one Muslim scholar comes up to the microphone and he says, we've heard brilliant lectures about the love of God and brilliant lectures about the power of God. But no one has mentioned the beauty of God. And I just thought I should mention that. And there was this moment where all of us were sort of like maybe not 100% of the people there, but I bet just about everybody felt it's like it took our breath away. He didn't say anything more. And we just were left with this moment of silence where there was something that opened us up beyond all of the words we had said that day. So
That's great.
Oh yeah. Okay. A few final announcements of sorts. One, Tom, I want you to give the invitation to the online event where everyone's going to be engaging Brian's book along with other open and relational theology texts. Two, remember, we're going to have another Q&A where all the specific questions about part 3 and the appendices and stuff will get discussed. You can always add more now. You can send the content of the class, tell them to go to doistaychristian.com, join up and stuff, and send their questions, use the videos for discussion groups, all that kind of stuff, because we will do it after Theology Beer Camp in a couple of weeks, because until then, it's like all trying to organize things, which I should not be the organizer of lots of details. Third, I have occasionally sent emails. Brian's gotten one before after a podcast where I tell people, this is the book I hope you write next. So after listening to this conversation at the Eschaton, or maybe before, I have the book I would love Tom Oord and Brian McLaren to tag team on. It's called Because God. Subtitle is because I believe in God, I believe in God because. And the two parts of the book, and in the inversion after Do I Stay Christian, is you do because I believe in God, and then a series of statements where the God and love Venn diagram works. Second half of the book, I believe in God because, and then you generate with deep curiosity, wisdom, and intellectual integrity why you affirm ultimate reality. But ultimate reality should not be affirmed outside of a community where the affirmation entails material engagement. And listening to your conversation, along with reading tons of both of you and being your friends and such, I'm just like, oh, the eschatological banquet includes matchmaking. That, or maybe it's like a podcast series. I don't know. I just would like the because you both share the trepidation and have gone back and forth on using the word God and insist in this kind of Venn diagram thing I came up with thinking about you both were showing up when Brian was like, I could show up tonight. Internet's back on. I just think y'all inverting the God part, not with methodology and justification, but with because I believe in God, here's what it looks like. And both of you have said that. Tom says, I want people to think I was someone that was committed to the way of love when I'm dead. Brian, the whole part 3, right? Like of the book is going, I'm staying Christian because I would like our ecosystem to thrive, the poor to be lifted up, and Jesus not to be like fan fiction for the oppressors, right? So anyway, that's my like lure of sorts to y'all having future conversations. So Brian and I hang out again soon. Tom, tell them where you'll be like engaging intellectuals to be engaging Brian's book and such on the interwebs.
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Trip, for the opportunity to chat with you and Brian. Thanks, Brian, for the exchange. The event that Trip is mentioning is actually coming up in February. It's the International Online Open and Relational Theology Conference, in which we feature books written in roughly the last year that have open and relational theological themes. And Brian's book has various of those themes in it, even though he may not always use the exact language. He definitely thinks like an open and relational thinker. So that will be February 10th through 11th, fully online. There'll probably be, I don't know, 15 or 16 books, 15 or 16 hour-long sessions. Don't expect everyone to be at all of those live, so there'll be recordings you could get, but that's coming up in February.
Awesome. Well, we'll send you a link. Brian, thank you for like showing back up even though you weren't anticipating internet. Tom, thank you for saying yes to my text solicitation. And I'll send everyone a link to remind once Brian and I reschedule the final one. But this has been a blast. Thank you all. And as someone who is full of gratitude for Tom and Brian, this has been like a significant treat. And it'll take a while before I calm down enough to go to bed. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you.